This special episode of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you by Getty's Bike Tours. It's summertime. Take a bike tour with Getty's Bike. Call 717-752-7752 or go to gettysbike.com.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
As 1863 began, the Union Army of the Potomac found itself in a general malaise. Its failed attempt at another push towards Richmond, known as the Mud March, had served as the nail in the coffin of Army Commander Ambrose E Burnside. When Joseph Hooker took his place as commander of the Army of the Potomac, the changes he implemented helped boost the morale and the confidence of his troops. But Hooker squandered that goodwill by bungling the Chancellorsville Campaign in the early days of May 1863. While some believe that drunkenness or the artillery round that knocked him out for a short time were the probable causes of such bungling, Hooker himself told Major General Abner Doubleday while on the road to Gettysburg, "I was not hurt by a shell, and I was not drunk. For once, I lost confidence in Hooker, and that is all there was to it." After Chancellorsville, while Hooker was looking for ways to redeem himself, Robert E. Lee was setting the wheels in motion for his second invasion of the North. By mid-June, two great armies totaling somewhere around 150,000 men, with tens of thousands of horses and mules, miles of wagons, and in one of those armies, human beings that were owned by other human beings, marched into Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, everyday citizens in a bustling country town called Gettysburg were going about their daily business while reading about the war in any or all of the town's 3 newspapers. War had not left them untouched, however. Constant threats of invasion plagued them since they first sent their local militia, the Gettysburg Blues, to fight to preserve the Union in 1861. By the 4th of July of 1863, this small town of 2,400 would be left with the daunting task of cleaning up the carnage and healing many times its number in wounded soldiers who wore both blue and gray. On the last day of June, the lead elements of these two armies would be poised for the commencement of the greatest, bloodiest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. But very few had any notion of that as they closed their eyes to sleep that night. Lee reorganizes.
April 8, 1863. I am inclined to think that will be the move we make. March for Maryland, turning the Yankee Army, and force them to fall back upon Washington. I am now in favor of going straight through Maryland into Pennsylvania, and I believe we can do it. General Lee undoubtedly has some bold plan upon foot. Brigadier General Dorsey Pender.
As unlikely and great as Lee's victory at Chancellorsville was, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia knew all too well that his victory had done hardly more than postpone the inevitable. Lee knew that the Army of the Potomac outnumbered and outsupplied his own. Just as it was 9 months earlier, Lee faced a dilemma between one of two things: either to retire to Richmond and stand a siege which must ultimately have ended in surrender, or to invade Pennsylvania. Victory on Northern soil might urge the peace Democrats in the North to push to bring the war to a close with reasonable terms for a free and independent Confederacy. Perhaps even, Britain and France would intervene on the Confederacy's behalf. But as always, supplies were Lee's immediate concern. Southern railroads were too inefficient and inadequate to keep Lee supplied. Moreover, the region the railroads operated in was crawling with enemy troops. Thus, Lee was not able to keep his men properly clothed or fed. For Lee's cavalry, the matter of horseshoes and the nails and forges required to shape and apply them was also a difficult one.
It was not an uncommon occurrence to see a cavalryman leading his limping horse along the road, while from his saddle dangled the hoofs of a dead horse, which he had cut off for the sake of the sound shoes nailed to them. Henry B. McClellan, Adjutant to General Stuart.
Major General Henry Harry Heath recalled that Lee once told him, "The question of food for this army gives me more trouble and uneasiness than anything else." Lush and untouched, Pennsylvania would be able to feed his men and horses for months. Lee had to invade again. In Richmond, Lee lobbied for 3 days for Confederate officials to support his plan. Postmaster General John Reagan from Texas cared more about the Confederate war effort and its armies in the West, and insisted that Lee divert some of his troops to aid the besieged city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. President Jefferson Davis, whose home was in Mississippi, could be described as uneasy about Lee's idea. The situation for the Southern cause was not as good as the Army of Northern Virginia's victories made it seem. Stonewall Jackson was dead. The war in the East was at an impasse, and in the Western theater, Union General Ulysses S. Grant had Vicksburg in a vice. A bold move was now required in order to break the stalemate in the East or the siege in the West, and Robert E. Lee was just the man to do it. Lee's almost godlike stature in the South helped him win over his doubters, causing them to approve his plan by a vote of 5-1. The Army of Northern Virginia would once again invade the North. Lee's first order of business after his return from Richmond was to reorganize his army. Since taking command in June of 1862, Lee had felt the two-corps system currently in use was cumbersome and ineffective. Each corps contained somewhere around 30,000 men, proving too difficult for one corps commander to handle, especially in the wooded areas of Virginia. On May 30th, Lee announced his changes. Retaining his position at the helm of the 1st Corps, consisting of the divisions of Lafayette McLaws, George E. Pickett, and John Bell Hood, was James Longstreet, Lee's old war horse, who Lee looked at as his trusted advisor. Longstreet was also the second in command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Moving up to take Jackson's place at the head of the 2nd Corps with a promotion to lieutenant general was Richard Stoddard Ewell, one of Jackson's division commanders who often complained about Jackson's tendency to leave his subordinates in the dark about his plans. Under Ewell's command were the divisions of Jubal A. Early, Edward Johnson, and Robert E. Rhodes. The new 3rd Corps, commanded by Ambrose Powell A.P. Hill, the hero of Sharpsburg, was comprised of the divisions of R.H. Anderson, formerly of Longstreet's Corps, Henry Heath, placed in command of a newly formed division, and William Dorsey Pender, Hill's preferred choice to take command of his old division. Lee described Hill as the best soldier of his grade with me. Major General James Ewell Brown Jeb Stuart retained command of his cavalry division, which was expanded from 3 to 6 brigades. One of these brigade commanders was Brigadier General William Grumble Jones, who earned his nickname for his curmudgeonly ways. While Stuart was flamboyant and gregarious, Jones was disheveled in appearance, sporting blue jeans and a homemade jacket. There was a bitterness between Stuart and Jones that would soon play out during the Gettysburg Campaign. Robert E. Lee's son, William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, affectionately called Rooney, also commanded a brigade under Stuart, as did his cousin, Fitzhugh Lee. Unlike the Union Army, in which the reserve artillery was under the command of one general attached to Army headquarters, the reserve artillery in the Army of Northern Virginia was attached directly to each corps in battalions for the Gettysburg Campaign. Each infantry corps had roughly 20,000 men, and when combined with the cavalry and artillery, Lee marched north with roughly 75,000 Confederates, who referred to themselves rather tongue-in-cheek as Lee's Miserables, a reference to Victor Hugo's 1862 novel, Les Miserables. While Lee's army may have looked miserable, the boys in blue across the Rappahannock actually were miserable. I must tell you, Lincoln wrote Army of the Potomac Commander Joseph Hooker, that I have some painful intimations that some of your corps and division commanders are not giving you their entire confidence. This would be ruinous, if true. Going into the Chancellorsville Campaign, Joe Hooker was overly confident, bombastic, and perhaps delusional. Lee's victory over Hooker's larger army would have humbled most other generals, but not fighting Joe Hooker. Instead, Hooker regained his cocky delusions and began to plan for another attack on Lee. No general battle was fought at Chancellorsville, Hooker wrote to Lincoln. I was unwilling to give battle with such great odds against me. We lost no honor at Chancellorsville. He called the battle a reverse that he blamed on a cause which could not be foreseen and not provided against. Had Chancellorsville been a victory for Hooker, he may have enjoyed the enthusiastic confidence from his officers and men and his bosses in Washington, but Chancellorsville was a defeat, and an embarrassing one at that. Lincoln, on May 14th, advised Hooker to mark time and keep Lee at bay, rather than attempt another crossing of the Rappahannock and the battle or battles that were sure to follow. He did make sure to let Hooker know, however, that this was advice and not an order. Lincoln also advised Hooker to take the time to get his army back into shape. Perhaps to relieve himself from the responsibility of future failure, Hooker accepted the advice. The high command of the Army of the Potomac had lost faith in Hooker's abilities as an army commander. John Sedgwick and Henry Slocum, two corps commanders, had been secretly plotting to have Hooker replaced. But Lincoln was hardly ready to find another army commander yet, saying, "I am not disposed to throw away a gun because it misfired once." Later in May, Hooker caught wind of a private meeting between Generals Reynolds and Meade and Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin, in which the two generals expressed their displeasure and lack of faith in Hooker. Curtin, ever the alarmist, quickly took flight to the White House to warn Lincoln of this dissension. On May 15th, Hooker summoned Meade to his headquarters for an explanation. Meade explained that his comments were made in confidence and that Governor Curtin had no right to repeat them. But he added that everything he had said to Curtin he had already said to Hooker directly during the course of the battle. As the conversation continued, tempers began to rise in both Meade and Hooker. 5th Corps Staff Officer Alexander Webb recalled that Meade's famous temper had eventually boiled over and that he damned Hooker very freely. Once it got to that point, Webb left the tent in haste in order to avoid becoming a witness for a court-martial. Hooker and Meade soon cooled down, but the damage was done between them. "I'm sorry to tell you," Meade wrote his wife, "that I am in open war with Hooker." Likely, Joseph Hooker had to deal with changes of personnel in the high command, though not as many. Darius Couch, Major General in command of the 2nd Corps, had been so disgusted with Hooker's mismanagement of the Chancellorsville Campaign that he requested reassignment and was subsequently transferred to command the newly formed Department of the Susquehanna headquartered in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Replacing him at the head of the 2nd Corps was Division Commander Winfield Scott Hancock. After the Battle of Chancellorsville, the self-promoting Cavalry Division Commander Alfred Pleasanton replaced Cavalry Corps Commander Major General George Stoneman. Stoneman was relieved and sent back to Washington to receive medical treatment for chronic hemorrhoids exacerbated by cavalry service. Once relegated to a mere administrative role, Chief of Artillery Brigadier General Henry Hunt was put back in command of the Artillery Reserve of the Army of the Potomac. Proving to be an important and valuable change was the creation of the Bureau of Military Information, or BMI, back when Hooker took command during the winter. Until the BMI was created, the Army of the Potomac received its intelligence from the famous Pinkerton Agency. The Pinkertons, as good as they may have been as detectives in civilian matters, were not military intelligence gatherers, nor military analysts. Too often, they overestimated the strength of their Confederate foes, paralyzing commanders like George McClellan. Unlike Pinkerton, Colonel George Sharp would utilize military men. His agents would gather information from prisoners of war, refugees, Southern newspapers, documents recovered from battlefields, and they would figure out where the enemy's army was when on the march based on disruption of telegraph communications. As a result, more accurate information came in. During the Gettysburg Campaign, the BMI would prove to be invaluable to the Army of the Potomac. But it was the infantry that weighed heavily on Hooker's mind the most. Thousands of enlistments were about to expire, and while Lee's 3 corps grew in their respective numbers, Hooker's were shrinking. While Hooker's foot soldiers had better uniforms, wore better footwear, and were better fed than Lee's, they did not possess a great advantage in arms and ammunition, as it is traditionally believed. Several regiments fired smoothbore muskets that used buck and ball as the projectile. Buck and ball consisted of 3 small lead balls and 1 larger one. But what plagued the Army of the Potomac most was a lack of confidence. Not necessarily in itself, but rather of the red-headed, blue-eyed egotist at the head of the army. Most of the Army's problems, however, were more the fault of Washington than the Army's itself. While the number of soldiers was on the wane, most who remained were veterans, with much experience marching long, hard miles and even harder fighting. While Southern newspapers derided Union troops by calling them hirelings, foreign mercenaries, and scum of the cities, the opposite was true. Most were born in America, and they volunteered for service. While their motives for doing so varied from love of adventure, financial security, or patriotism, there wasn't much of a difference between Billy Yank and Johnny Reb. On May 27th, Hooker received word from his chief of intelligence that Lee's army was under marching orders and would most likely move forward upon or above our right flank. Then on the 4th of June, Hooker's hot air balloons observed that some Confederate camps in the area of Fredericksburg had been abandoned. Hooker wanted to cross the Rappahannock and pitch into those Confederate troops remaining. Lincoln was quick to squash this notion within an hour of receiving word from Hooker. To attack the Confederate forces remaining at Fredericksburg while another force maneuvered to Hooker's right might have caused the Army of the Potomac to become entangled upon the river like an ox jumped half over a fence and liable to be torn by dogs front and rear, without a fair chance to gore one way or kick the other. Hooker felt confused and stymied. He turned to his intelligence officer for more information. He would soon learn that Confederate cavalry was massed in the area of Culpeper, Virginia. Now was his chance to find out what was going on. Stuart was in all his glory. Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalrymen were arrayed in double-line formation on the plain just west of the Rappahannock, near Culpeper, Virginia. Mounted and at attention, Stuart's men waited in silence. Flags fluttered in the late spring breeze. Horses snorted and stomped their hooves as they stood in line, anxious for whatever their riders were about to compel them to do. Stuart gave them one proud, final look before giving them the signal. At the start of the war, the cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia originated as separate regiments or smaller units, like Jeb Stuart's 1st Virginia Cavalry or Hampton's Legion, which were attached to larger units or districts. But by September of 1861, with ringing endorsements from Generals Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard, Joseph E. Johnston, and James Longstreet, Jeb Stuart found himself promoted to Brigadier General and given command of the cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia, which at that time was a single brigade. By the time of the Antietam campaign, Stuart had received a promotion to Major General, and his cavalry had ballooned to a division of 4 brigades, and then to 6 by Gettysburg. The Confederate cavalry did not have an easy time being supplied and outfitted for life in the field. At the start of the war, cavalrymen furnished their own horses, saddles, and tack. English round-tree saddles were quite common, and did more harm to the backs of the horses than anything else. Eventually, they were replaced with a government-issued saddle designed for the horses' comfort, but not the troopers. The troopers were armed with a hodgepodge of pistols, sabers, rifles, and carbines. The wealthier counties of Virginia were able to arm their companies with revolvers, but others could not. Breech-loading carbines, short rifles that load from the rear rather than the muzzle, were scarce, and most regiments couldn't scrounge more than 1 or 2 squadrons worth of them anyway. Beverly Robertson's 2 regiments from North Carolina, which joined Stuart's division in May of 1863, carried sabers and Enfield rifles. While a rifle had longer range than a carbine, it was an impractical arm for the mounted service. When a cavalryman's horse was killed or disabled, he would be sent home to procure another for himself. It usually took 30 to 60 days for this process to play out, but often it would take much longer if good horse flesh was scarce, or, in the case of such units from states like the Carolinas or Georgia, distance added to the time. This highly inefficient system sometimes found Stuart's cavalry so plagued with absenteeism that its numbers had been cut in half.
There are 3 brigades of cavalry 3 miles from Culpeper County Courthouse, toward Kelly's Ford. These are Fitz Lee's, William H. Fitzhugh Lee's, and Wade Hampton's brigades. The Confederate Army is under marching orders, and an order from General Lee was very lately read to the troops, announcing a campaign of long marches and hard fighting. Colonel George Sharp, Chief of Intelligence, Army of the Potomac.
George Sharp's report to General Hooker was correct. His Bureau of Military Information had noticed that on May 22nd, Stuart reviewed the 3 brigades he had under his command at the time, totaling about 4,000 men. Shortly thereafter, Grumble Jones's and Beverly Robertson's brigades joined Stuart, and so, on June 5th, Stuart called for another review, with the expectation that his commander, Robert E. Lee, would be present. To Stuart's disappointment, Lee could not attend, but the pageantry went on nonetheless, with the cavalry being put through its paces in a mock charge at the horse artillery lined up and firing blanks from a ridge, all to the delight of the civilian spectators in attendance. On June 7th, Stuart received word that Lee wished to review the cavalry on the following day. So, on June 8th, Stuart, resplendent in his new uniform, complete with a cape and a black ostrich plume in his hat, gave the signal to his waiting troopers on the plain. Bugles rang out their calls to advance. 22 regiments of cavalry maneuvered into columns of 4s, their horses kicking up a huge cloud of dust as they proudly marched by their beloved Army commander, Robert E. Lee. Lee wouldn't allow the pomp and circumstance of the review of June 5th. No galloping, no wasting of powder. Stuart's men and horses needed to be well rested, and his supplies of powder needed to be conserved for the march north that was already underway. Men of Major General John Bell Hood's infantry division of Longstreet's 1st Corps also stood by and watched the review. Hood was a former cavalryman and decided his men might get a kick out of watching the pageantry of that branch of the service, which they typically treated with disdain and scorn. Hoots and hollers, jeers and catcalls filled the air as the cavalry passed. When the raw recruits fell out of step or a trooper's hat flew off his head, the din of derision would swell to a crescendo. Even Stuart wasn't immune from the ridicule of Hood's veterans. Then Lee appeared, joining Stuart at the head of the column, and the jeers turned to genuine cheers for Marse Robert. Out of courtesy to Lee, the cheering was extended to Jeb Stuart. Lee later wrote to his wife that, "It was a splendid sight. The men and horses looked well. They recuperated since last fall. Stuart was in all his glory." Grumble Jones, no fan of Stuart's, remarked, "No doubt the Yankees have witnessed from their signal stations this show in which Stuart has exposed to view his strength and aroused their curiosity. They will want to know what is going on, and if I'm not mistaken, we'll be over early in the morning to investigate." After the review, Stuart conferred with Lee while his brigades went into bivouac roughly 8 miles from Culpeper near Brandy Station. The next morning, they were to cross to the Yankee side of the Rappahannock River in a move to protect the Army's flank as it disappeared into the cover of the Shenandoah Valley. So far as Lee knew, Hooker was not yet wise to his movements. But just as Grumble Jones surmised, Hooker was at least aware that Lee's army was on the move, though he wasn't aware of Lee's intentions. Fearing that Stuart's cavalry was moving to strike his rear, Hooker sent Pleasanton's 3 Union cavalry divisions, supported by 2 infantry brigades, on a spoiling raid, with orders to disperse the Confederate cavalry. The Battle of Brandy Station.
The only time in my 14 months' service with General Stuart that he seemed rattled was when Frank Dean, one of his couriers, dashed up and told him that the Yankees were at Brandy Station. This was startling indeed. Frank Robertson, General Stuart's staff.
No fires were allowed in the Union cavalry camps on the night of June 8th. Troopers ate cold dinners, then slept on the ground with their horses' reins looped around an arm. All was quiet and calm, for just across the Rappahannock camped Jeb Stuart's Confederates. Pleasanton's combined force of 11,000 cavalry and infantry was poised for a double envelopment of Jeb Stuart and his 9,500 cavaliers. Just around 4:30 a.m., John Buford's Union division, led by the brigade of Colonel Benjamin Grimes Davis, crossed the Rappahannock River at Beverly's Ford in a thick fog and brushed aside Confederate pickets from the 6th Virginia Cavalry.
At about daylight, the Yanks drove in our pickets stationed at Beverly's Ford on the Rappahannock and came near surprising us in bed. They charged up to our camp and killed and wounded several horses before we could get out. Confederate artillerymen.
Behind the picket line were 4 batteries of Stuart's horse artillery parked in preparation for the day's march. Further behind them, about 2 miles from the ford at St. James Church, was the brigade of William Grumble Jones. Carbine and pistol shots crackled through the morning air, waking Jones. It took only a moment for him to come to his senses, and once aware of what was going on, Jones sent the 6th and 7th Virginia to meet the threat. In their haste to get at these Yankees, some troopers were barely dressed, and many rode their horses bareback. Major Cabell E. Flournoy of the 6th Virginia was able to rally about 100 men and charged with them into the Federals. But Flournoy was soon forced to withdraw in a hurry, as he and his men were badly outnumbered. Lieutenant R.O. Allen's horse was wounded, causing Allen to be left behind during Flournoy's withdrawal. Allen took cover in a tree line when he spotted a Union officer, Colonel Benjamin Grimes Davis, at the head of the column of Yankees. Down to only 1 bullet in his revolver, Allen decided it would be best spent taking out the brave blue-bellied officer daring to lead his men from the front. So Allen spurred his wounded horse towards Davis, whose back was turned. In the nick of time, Davis turned around and faced Allen for long enough to see that Allen was charging at him. Davis began swinging his saber in an effort to hit the charging rebel. Allen saved himself by dropping down to the horse's side and fired his revolver at Davis, sending his last bullet through the colonel's brain. Allen then galloped off to the safety of his own lines. The action of Grumble Jones's men enabled most of Stuart's artillery, which was camped dangerously close to Buford's troops, to fall back and form a line around St. James Church. Meanwhile, on Fleetwood Hill, Stuart was drinking his morning coffee at his headquarters. Fleetwood Hill, which ran north and south, was about a half a mile northeast of Brandy Station and around 4 miles behind the scene of Buford's crossing. Stuart hastily sent his supply wagons towards Culpeper while his staff scurried this way and that to get themselves together to meet whatever danger was about to befall them. Stuart then ordered reinforcements ahead to the sound of the fighting. As Buford's brigades pushed their way further into the Confederate lines, Major Robert Morris, commander of the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry, was ordered to clear the Confederates from his front. Morris and the 6th Pennsylvania, also known as Rush's Lancers, charged against the Confederate artillery.
We flew along, our men yelling like demons. Grape and canister were poured into our left flank and a storm of rifle bullets onto our front. We had to leap 3 wide, deep ditches, and many of our horses and men piled up in a writhing mass in those ditches and were ridden over. Captain Henry Wayland, 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry.
The 6th Pennsylvania's charge failed when Confederates counterattacked and drove them back after a brutal hand-to-hand melee. Major Morris was captured. One Confederate described the charge as brilliant and glorious. The 6th Pennsylvania suffered the highest casualty rate of any regiment at Brandy Station. This charge, however, seemed to stabilize the battle for the time being. Meanwhile, on the Confederate right, messengers from Beverly Robertson's brigade brought Grumble Jones some unwelcome news. A large dust cloud had been seen rising from the direction of Kelly's Ford in the Confederates' right rear. Jones rushed a courier to Stewart. Jeb Stewart was on the scene of the St. James Church line. The seriousness of the event still did not seem to occur to Stewart or his staff, as a few of his more youthful staff members climbed a nearby cherry tree. Jubilantly, they picked and threw cherries down to their comrades on the ground until a Federal shell careened through the tree. The shell sent splintered branches flying and the young staff officers plummeting to the relative safety of the ground. Stewart, beside himself with laughter, said, "What's the matter, boys? Cherries getting sour?" Around this time, one of Jones's couriers rode up to Stewart and delivered the message about the threat to his flank. The doubtful Stewart arrogantly replied, "Tell General Jones to attend to the Yankees in his front, and I'll watch the flanks." Upon receiving this reply, Jones grimly scoffed, "So he thinks they ain't coming, does he? Well, let him alone. He'll damn soon see for himself." The cloud of dust Jones warned Stewart about was being raised by the flanking force of General David McMurtry Gregg's and Alfred N. Dufay's divisions. Dufay's force split from Gregg's and proceeded further west in the direction of Stevensburg, roughly 5 miles from Brandy Station, in an effort to threaten the Confederate rear. Meanwhile, Gregg turned his column to the north, directly towards Brandy Station. Not a single rebel stood in Gregg's way, and Fleetwood Hill, which commanded his route, had no defense to speak of. Meanwhile, back at St. James Church, another courier rode up to Stewart, this time from that part of Stewart's own staff, which he left behind at Fleetwood Hill. In his haste to reach Beverly's Ford with 3 brigades to fight Buford's force, Stewart left Fleetwood Hill occupied only by his adjutant, Major Henry McClellan, and a smattering of couriers. McClellan, ever the good staff officer, went to see the threat to the right for himself.
And so it was. Within cannon shot of the hill, a long column of the enemy filled the road, which here skirted the woods. They were pressing steadily forward upon the railroad station, which would, in a few moments, be in their possession. Major Henry McClellan.
At the foot of Fleetwood Hill was a lone, undersupplied 6-pounder howitzer. Without batting an eye, McClellan ordered Lieutenant John W. Carter to deploy his gun to the heights and open fire with whatever ammunition he had left. McClellan promptly sent a courier to Stewart with a request for reinforcements, while he hoped that this solitary howitzer would slow or halt Gregg's Union cavalry long enough for help to arrive. Stewart, seemingly still in disbelief that what was happening was indeed happening, ordered a staff officer to go back to McClellan by saying, "Ride back there and see what all this foolishness is about." As this officer was leaving, another courier arrived and confirmed the news. "General," he shouted, "the Yankees are at Brandy." Stewart was now left with no doubt when he heard the sound of Lieutenant Carter's 6-pounder open fire. Now Stewart was quick to act. He sent 4 more artillery pieces and 2 of Grumble Jones's regiments to McClellan's aid. Meanwhile, McClellan found that his bluff had worked. Gregg's lead brigade under British soldier of fortune, Colonel Sir Percy Wyndham, deployed skirmishers and returned battery fire. Gregg ordered Wyndham's brigade to charge up Fleetwood Hill's western slope.
Not 50 yards below, Colonel Percy Wyndham was advancing the 1st New Jersey Cavalry in magnificent order, in columns of squadrons, with flags and guidons flying. Major Henry McClellan.
Simultaneously racing to the scene at full gallop from the opposite slope of the hill were Grumble Jones's regiments, the 6th and 7th Virginia Cavalry. Just as Carter's lone howitzer had exhausted its ammunition, Jones's men crowned the heights and plunged over the opposite slope into Wyndham's men with what one veteran called a dead heavy crash. Wyndham's cavalry split Jones's charging battalions like waves on the bow of a ship, according to the adjutant of the 1st New Jersey, Marcus Kitchen. Kitchen's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Broderick, galloped straight into a group of Confederates, running his saber through one of them, slashing the forehead of another, and shooting a third before he was swarmed by a dozen or so of the rebels and taken down. Kitchen himself was on the way to assist his chief when he too became the target of a gang of Confederate troopers.
The first one fired at me and missed. Before he could again cock his revolver, my saber took him in the neck. The blood gushed out in a black-looking stream. He gave a horrible yell and fell over the side of his horse. Marcus Kitchen, 1st New Jersey Cavalry.
Kitchen spurred his horse at full gallop to a second Confederate, but his horse was shot out from under him, throwing Kitchen to the ground, leaving him half-conscious as the melee swirled around him. Before long, 2 Union brigades were entangled with 2 Confederate brigades. As the dust swirled around the mass of men and horses, so too did the sounds of mortal combat. The guttural gulps of men as they receive a saber blow or a pistol shot to the abdomen. The shrieks of frightened and wounded horses. The pop, pop, pop of revolvers sending their deadly projectiles toward a foe only a few feet away. And the clanging and scraping of sabers. Wyndham's brigade gained ground, overrunning the 4 pieces of artillery Stuart had sent to hold the hill. Then fresh rebel reinforcements arrived, scattering Wyndham's men. At the base of the hill, the 6th New York Battery had unlimbered 3 of its pieces. In no time, the 35th Virginia Battalion poured into the battery's position. One Federal trooper remembered, "One rebel on a splendid horse who sabered 3 gunners while I was chasing him. He wheeled in and out, would dart away, and then come sweeping back and cut down another man in a manner that seemed almost supernatural." Lieutenant Colonel E.V. White, the 35th's commander, recalled that the men of the battery fought with desperation. There was no demand for surrender or offer of one until nearly all the men were killed or wounded. Only 6 of the 36 men of the 6th New York Battery would come out unharmed. Meanwhile, to the northeast, Buford was trying again to dislodge the Confederates around St. James Church. The 6th Pennsylvania charged a second time, but the 9th Virginia checked their efforts and repulsed them. Then the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, a tough unit of regular Army troopers, smashed headlong into the fray.
There was little halting to make prisoners. Those who surrendered were told by emotion to go to the rear, and those who resisted were sabered or shot till they reeled from their saddles, the victor rushing on to engage a new foe. Captain Wesley Merritt, 2nd United States Cavalry.
At one point in the melee, Captain Merritt fought one-on-one with Brigadier General Rooney Lee. Merritt wounded the younger Lee with his saber. Rooney Lee would also be shot in the thigh before the battle was over, but not by Merritt. Days after Brandy Station, the Confederate hospital that Lee was convalescing in was captured by Union troops, and the son of the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia would become a prisoner of war as his father undertook an invasion of enemy territory. By the time the 10-hour battle was over, Stuart's cavalry held the field.
Pleasanton's men withdrew, but not in defeat. Hooker's orders to him were to disperse and destroy Stuart's forces. Pleasanton, however, claimed that he was only ordered to make a reconnaissance in force. Either way, the Union cavalry had performed as aggressively and with as much determination as their Southern counterparts for the first time in the war. With a total of around 20,000 cavalry and infantry involved, the Battle of Brandy Station yielded a little over 1,400 casualties. Jeb Stuart needed to rest and refit his division, and Robert E. Lee was in no position to wait for him. The Army of Northern Virginia, led by Richard S. Ewell's 2nd Corps, crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains at Chester Gap in Virginia on June 10, 1863. Stuart had been surprised twice during the battle, the very thing that cavalry is supposed to guard against, and he was roundly criticized in the press. The Richmond Examiner went so far as to refer to Stuart's cavalry as puffed up, and the surprises were the consequences of negligence and bad management. Major General Lafayette McLaws, a division commander in Longstreet's 1st Corps, wrote to his wife about Brandy Station. As you will perceive from General Lee's dispatch, the enemy were driven across the river again. All this is not true, but it will be better to allow the impression to prevail. The enemy were not, however, driven back, or retired at their leisure, having accomplished, I suppose, what they intended. The cockiness demonstrated by Stuart and the confidence displayed by Lee permeated the Army of Northern Virginia. These attitudes, combined with the sudden coming of age of the Union cavalry at Brandy Station, foreshadowed things to come in less than a month at Gettysburg. Lee's infantry slips away. On June 10th, United States Secretary of War Edwin Stanton created 2 new departments: the Department of the Susquehanna and the Department of the Monongahela in Pennsylvania. Both were tasked with organizing emergency volunteer units to defend the state during the invasion. In command of the Army of the Susquehanna, where Gettysburg was located, was former Army of the Potomac 2nd Corps Commander Major General Darius N. Couch, who would initially make his headquarters in Chambersburg, but ultimately in Harrisburg. With Lee's army already on the move north and Hooker's still near Fredericksburg, these 2 new departments will prove to be too little, too late. Lee intended to march his infantry into the Shenandoah Valley in order to conceal its movements. Running on a north-south line, the Shenandoah Valley continues straight up into Pennsylvania, where it is known as the Cumberland Valley. Its passes would be covered by Stuart's cavalry in order to prohibit Hooker's troops from penetrating the valley and thwarting the invasion. Now Hooker knew that Lee was on the move. While he correctly guessed that Lee was invading Maryland again, he did not know for sure whether or not Lee was doing so for conquest, or if he was only going far enough to position the Army of Northern Virginia in such a way as to be able to swoop south down onto Washington. Joe Hooker needed more information, so he cautiously set his troops on the road to follow Lee, being sure to keep his army between Lee and Washington. The Second Battle of Winchester.
Major General Schenck. No attempt should be made to hold Winchester against a large force of the enemy. Major General Halleck, General-in-Chief.
I deem it impossible that Lee's army, with its immense artillery and baggage trains, could have escaped from the Army of the Potomac and crossed the Blue Ridge. Major General Robert H. Milroy.
Long before European settlement, the Shenandoah Valley and the Winchester, Virginia area were sacred hunting grounds of Aboriginal Americans and changed hands through warfare for generations. By the time of the Revolutionary War, Daniel Morgan's company of militia was raised from the area and sent to the aid of George Washington's army around Boston. When the Civil War came, Winchester had become a key strategic position for the Confederate States Army. The town and surrounding areas had already been the focus of military engagements during Johnston's defense of the Valley in 1861 and Jackson's Valley Campaign in 1862. Now in June of 1863, Winchester was in the hands of a Union garrison under the immediate command of Major General Robert H. Milroy, former lawyer turned judge and radical abolitionist. Milroy had, with his 2nd Division of the 8th Corps of the Middle Department, occupied Winchester since December of 1862. His superior, Major General Schenck, had been advised not to attempt to hold the city against a larger Confederate force. Milroy, who likened himself to Roman Emperor Nero, and who had no love or respect for the Southerners or secesh that he ruled over, arrogantly dismissed such advice. On June 14th, General Ewell and his Confederate 2nd Corps were perched to make Milroy regret such arrogance and initiated their advance against the defenses of Winchester. Jubal Early's division split up, leaving Gordon's brigade occupying the attention of Union outposts from the south, while Early and his 3 remaining brigades marched west to flank the Federal position. Skirmishing on Gordon's front took place all afternoon. At one point, as Gordon's brigade advanced against the 123rd Pennsylvania and 12th West Virginia, Carlin's Union battery opened fire on the Confederates. Milroy was convinced that the Confederate attack had failed and was over. What he did not know was that Early's other brigades had moved to the west of Winchester and had Milroy all but surrounded. Yet another division of Ewell's corps, that of Robert Rhodes, occupied Milroy's northern escape route several miles away at Martinsburg. At 6 p.m., Early's 20 artillery pieces opened fire on West Fort for nearly 45 minutes. General Hayes's brigade stormed the fortifications and, after a brief hand-to-hand struggle, caused the Federals to abandon their works, retreating to Fort Milroy to their east. To avoid letting Milroy escape, should he decide to order a retreat, Ewell ordered Johnson's division to occupy the Charlestown Road to Milroy's east-northeast. At the same time this was going on, Milroy was holding a council of war with his subordinates, where the decision was made to retreat to Harper's Ferry via the Charlestown Road. After spiking the cannon and destroying their carriages, Milroy's men snuck out under the cover of darkness. Ewell and his Confederates had no clue about this fact until the following morning, when they awoke to find that the Yankees were gone. But upon his retreat, Milroy's vanguard reached Johnson's Confederate skirmishers. Now Milroy had to fight his way out. Several uncoordinated and failed attempts to dislodge Johnson's brigades resulted in scores of Union soldiers surrendering or fleeing in every direction. In fact, only Milroy and his staff, his cavalry attachment, and other random units had been able to escape to Harper's Ferry. Winchester was now safely in Confederate hands. Furthermore, Ewell's corps, which had outnumbered Milroy 2 divisions to 1, only suffered 269 casualties while inflicting almost 4,000 on their foe. In addition, Ewell was able to capture 28 pieces of artillery and 300 horses, plus large amounts of much-needed food, clothing, medical supplies, and small arms ammunition. Most importantly, the gate to Pennsylvania had been violently kicked open. Milroy was later court-martialed and exonerated. Afterwards, he claimed that his brilliant defense of Winchester delayed the Confederates long enough to allow Hooker's army to gain ground, so that when the armies met, they would meet as they did at Gettysburg. What the Second Battle of Winchester dispelled, however, were doubts about Ewell's competency at the helm of a corps and confirmed the faith that his troops had in him. Of the Union boys lying mortally wounded by Ewell's bullets, was a member of the 87th Pennsylvania, Johnston Jack Skelly, a native and citizen of Gettysburg. Upon learning of Jack's presence on the field, Confederate soldier John Wesley Culp went to find him. Jack and Wes had grown up together in Gettysburg. Wesley had taken employment with the local carriage maker C. William Hoffman. In 1856, Hoffman decided to move his business to Shepherdstown, Virginia, and invited several of his employees along. Wes's brother, William, declined, but Wesley accepted the invitation, leaving his childhood home, family, and friends behind in Gettysburg. In Shepherdstown, Wesley and Hoffman's 3 sons joined the Hamtramck Guards, the local militia and drinking club. When Civil War broke out, Wesley bid his fellow Gettysburg transplants a fond adieu as they left to return to Pennsylvania and fight for the Union. Wesley and the rest of the Hamtramck Guards enlisted in the Confederate service on the 20th of April, 1861, at Harper's Ferry. They became Company B of the 2nd Virginia, which was placed in the 1st Brigade under the command of Colonel Thomas Jonathan Jackson. The brigade and the man at its helm, in short time, earned the nickname Stonewall. Lincoln wrote, to General Hooker, Winchester and Martinsburg were both besieged yesterday. The enemy holds both places. Confederate troops are crossing the Potomac at Williamsport. I would like to hear from you. From Winchester, Ewell sent Robert Rhodes's infantry division north to raid Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Along with Rhodes's division was the irregular cavalry brigade of Albert Jenkins, a colorful character who often tucked his long beard into his belt when the wind was up. At 2 a.m. on June 15th, Jenkins led his cavalry on the road to Chambersburg.
June 15th, 1863. Today we heard that the rebels were crossing the river in heavy force and advancing on this state. Sarah Broadhead.
In the 1730s and 40s, Scotch, Irish, and German settlers began laying roots in what was then known as the Marsh Creek Settlement. Eventually, Samuel Geddes opened a tavern on the Marsh Creek Road, the major east-west road in the area. In 1761, he was fined for running a tavern without a license. In 1769, the Baltimore-Shippensburg Road was laid out and an intersection was created at the tavern. 25 years later, in 1786, his son James would lay out 210 lots, including a town square referred to as the Diamond, around the tavern. This new town would be known as Gettysburg. In 1800, Gettysburg became the county seat of the newly formed Adams County, named for then-President John Adams. The 1860 census shows that Gettysburg's population numbered around 2,400 and was primarily made up of German, Scots-Irish, and free blacks. The overwhelmingly Christian population of the town worshipped in 8 congregations and 7 churches. As the center of Adams County's legal business, Gettysburg was home to several lawyers. Education was well covered in Gettysburg. Private schools, including Carrie Shees's on the Chambersburg Pike and Rebecca Eyster's on the corner of High Street in Washington, Pennsylvania College, established in 1832, and the Lutheran Theological Seminary educated the youth from near and far. To support the large amounts of farms in the surrounding townships, various merchants kept shop there. Some people, such as Mary McAllister, made money by reselling cured meats that she had obtained from the farmers of the area to her fellow Gettysburgians. Others owned butcher shops, like James Pierce, who lived on the southwest corner of Baltimore and Breckinridge Streets. A candy store, like Philip P.D. Winters on the first block of Chambersburg Street. A photography studio, like Charles and Isaac Tyson had on York Street. Dry goods, general merchandise, and grocers also made Gettysburg hum with activity. James Fahnestock and two of his brothers owned the largest general store in town on the corner of Baltimore Street and Middle Street. In 1860, the census listed dozens of people whose occupation was shoemaker or cobbler. Yet, contrary to legend, there was no shoe factory or warehouse full of shoes in Gettysburg in 1863. Tanneries, ironworks, brickyards, blacksmiths, hotels, inns, and taverns rounded out the more common businesses found in town. Prior to the war, the people of Gettysburg engaged in a diverse economy, the primary industry in town being carriage making, which attracted related tradesmen such as wheelwrights, trim and canvas shops, and silversmiths. Many of Gettysburg's carriages were purchased by people south of the Mason-Dixon line, which was some 8 to 10 miles south of Gettysburg. As the Civil War loomed, the industry in Gettysburg began to tighten. But by 1863, the war had all but eliminated the carriage industry. Gettysburg's port for goods and services was Baltimore, which was a city of divided loyalties and political unrest. These two factors disrupted the town's economy. Local curmudgeon and former town constable John Burns had a few odd jobs. One of those jobs was a cobbler at the boot and shoe shop of town council president David Kendallhart. Among his other jobs, John Burns pumped water for the Gettysburg Waterworks. Burns, a veteran of the War of 1812, was not known to be a friendly neighbor with a kind word to offer. Gettysburg had the latest technological advances in communications, media, gas lighting, and transportation. In 1858, the railroad had come to town, and by 1863, Joseph Broadhead was an express messenger on the Hanover Junction, Hanover and Gettysburg Railroad. This railroad made the economy of Gettysburg boom when it was built, and in 1863, the line was in the process of being continued westward out of town. By July 1st, the progress made on this extension would be forever immortalized as the Railroad Cut. There were two telegraph offices in town, one at the railroad station and the other in the back of the home of John Scott on Chambersburg Street. Gettysburg had 3 newspapers, the Star and Banner, edited by John T. McElhenney, and the Adams Sentinel, edited by David Bueller. Both had a Republican bias. The Compiler, with a Democrat bias, was edited by Henry J. Staley. Republicans were very pro-Union, while the Democrats took a softer stance on the idea of Southern secession. Neither side was keen about the idea of equality for blacks, ironically evidenced by the fact that when, years prior to the war, free blacks attempted to join the local white anti-slavery societies and were denied. And so, those who were anti-slavery and black formed the Slaves' Refuge Society on their own.
We feel it our indispensable duty to assist such of our brethren as shall come among us for the purpose of liberating themselves, and to raise all the means in our power to effect our object, which is to give liberty to our brethren groaning under the tyrannical yoke of oppression. Resolution of the Slaves' Refuge Society.
A total of 10 roads led into Gettysburg, each one leading to and coming from other important cities and towns, such as Carlisle, Harrisburg, York, Hanover, Baltimore, Emmitsburg, Fairfield and Hagerstown, Cashtown and Chambersburg, and Mummersburg. All of these roads eventually funneled into the heart of Gettysburg. The layout of the town was typical for that time period, with the higher valued properties being in the blocks closest to the Diamond, with wide, tree-lined streets of dirt flanked by paved sidewalks. The streets and roads were laid out like the spokes of a wagon wheel, with the Diamond being the hub. Homes along the main roads had no front yards and came right up to the sidewalks. Most of the lots in the first few blocks off the square in any direction were developed and therefore presented an unbroken front. Backyards were surrounded by high board fences and contained a small stable or carriage house, a well and an outhouse or privy, as well as a small garden for the kitchen. All of this restricted free movement to the streets or the alleyways. Gettysburg by 1863 was a large town for the area, with a vibrant population that loved, hated, squabbled, showed kindness, gossiped, rallied together, made local celebrities out of the best looking or most gregarious, while making pariahs out of those of lesser fortune, just like any other society at any other point in history. Unlike most of those other societies, Gettysburg will endure a crucible of worry turned to terror, turned to misery. And that all began on June 15th, 1863, when Brigadier General Albert Jenkins's Confederate Cavalry Brigade crossed the Potomac and headed for Chambersburg. Unmistakable signs of the coming storm.
Our regiment was camped on the suburbs of a pretty Pennsylvania town. A stream was near the camp, and one afternoon I suggested to one of the boys in my company that we take a bath and a swim. They took to the idea and likewise to the water in quick time. There were no houses in the immediate vicinity, except for one on a hillside about a half a mile away, belonging to an old Spencer lady. We'd been swimming for a while when a boy trudged into camp in search of the captain. He had a note from the old maid which read, "Dear Sir, I wish you would order your men out of the stream. I can see them plainly through my brother's field glasses. Confederate soldier."
As Lee's army made its way across the Potomac through Maryland, then into Pennsylvania, an air of a pleasure excursion seemed to overtake the men and officers as they gathered supplies stolen from merchants and farmers. But in Chambersburg, merchant Jacob Hoke observed a sinister side to his town's uninvited guests.
One of the revolting features of this day was the scouring of the fields about the town and searching of houses for Negroes. These poor creatures, those of them who had not fled upon the approach of the foe, sought concealment in the growing wheat fields around town. Into these the cavalrymen rode in search of their prey, and many were caught. Some after a desperate chase and being fired at. Jacob Hoke.
Rachel Cormany, another resident of Chambersburg, was also moved to put pen to paper to record the inhumanity she witnessed.
Ugh, how it grated the hearts to have to sit quietly and look at such brutal deeds. I saw no men, all women and children. Some of the colored people who were raised here were taken along. I sat on the front step as they were driven by, just like we would drive cattle. Rachel Cormany.
Scenes such as these were repeated throughout south-central Pennsylvania, though Robert E. Lee had a standing order against bringing harm to persons or property, and that all supplies acquired must be paid for.
No alarm was felt until Governor Curtin sent a telegram directing the people to move their stores as quickly as possible. This made us begin to realize the fact that we were in some danger from the enemy, and some persons, thinking the rebels were near, became very much frightened, though the report was a mistake. Sarah Broadhead.
30-year-old Sarah Sally Broadhead and 32-year-old Joseph had a 4-year-old daughter named Mary. Together, they lived on the 3rd block of Chambersburg Street. After hearing the news of Confederates in Chambersburg, Sarah began a journal on June 15th. Ever since word of the Confederates crossing the Potomac first reached them, residents of Gettysburg and many other south-central Pennsylvania towns were beginning to panic and prepare as best they could for the approaching invaders. No one knew just where the Confederates were heading. No one knew what the Confederates would do to them should they descend upon their city or town. And no one knew where their own army even was to protect them and drive off the rebel hordes. Civilian militias began to form. Still, the townspeople worried, for what good could days-old militia do against Robert E. Lee's formidable veterans?
We had often heard that the rebels were about to make a raid, but had always found it a false alarm. Tilly Pierce, Gettysburg resident, age 15.
In truth, Gettysburg lived under a constant cloud of worry ever since the Civil War broke out in 1861. Just 10 miles to its south is the border with Maryland. While a border state that remained within the Union, Maryland's doing so was fragile. Its citizens had sympathies for both sides of the war. Virginia, the state which was home to the Confederate capital of Richmond, was not much farther beyond Maryland. On April 22, 1861, Gettysburg proudly sent the Gettysburg Independent Blues, its local militia that mainly had experience performing ceremonial duties, off to fight for the Union. Almost immediately, townspeople began to feel uneasy about sending its only armed force away. And so, that same night, the people of Gettysburg gathered in the courthouse to discuss forming a new home guard to ease the people's minds. Out of nowhere, 2 unknown men burst into the courthouse yelling, "The rebels are burning Hanover, and Gettysburg is next." The report was that 500 or more pug uglies from the city of Baltimore, a city with deep Confederate sympathies, were heading towards Gettysburg. As the citizens filtered out into the streets, a single rider galloped into town along York Street. "To arms," he shouted. "The rebels are coming." The calm curiosity that the people of Gettysburg embodied only a moment before gave way to utter panic and chaos. Word spread quickly through the town. The streets were crowded with panic-stricken people. Bells pealed across town to raise alarm. Riders, in the style of Paul Revere, were dispatched in every direction to warn neighboring hamlets and farms. Of course, all firearms and the ammunition for those firearms had left hours earlier with the Gettysburg Blues. All that was left was a smattering of shotguns, antique muskets, shovels, hoes, axes, knives, and a variety of other items, of little to no real use against the coming Pug Uglies. Finally, after midnight, Gettysburg's cooler heads decided to send a train to Hanover to see what was up. The train returned around dawn with the shocking news. It was a false alarm. Time and again between April of 1861 and June of 1863, the alarm would be raised, panic would ensue, and all would be let down as no rebel threat had developed. The only time the threat came close to being real was in 1862 when Jeb Stuart's cavalry invaded Pennsylvania and raided Chambersburg, then appeared at the foot of the mountains at Cashtown, just 8 or so miles west of Gettysburg. But Stuart had no interest in Gettysburg that day, and her citizens, once again, breathed a sigh of relief. Stuart's raid aside, a sense of the boy who cried wolf began to lull the people of Gettysburg into a complacency that would last up until the first shots of the Battle of Gettysburg. With Jenkins's raid on Chambersburg on June 15, 1863, refugees flooded through Gettysburg with the familiar warning of "the rebels are coming." Not all Gettysburg residents brushed off these warnings. Michael Jacobs, a professor at Pennsylvania College, was not so dismissive when he noted in his diary that there were unmistakable signs of the coming storm. Gettysburg quickly snapped out of its trance when the flood of refugees bearing the news of rebels in Chambersburg was too overwhelming to ignore. Immediately, merchants like the Fonstock brothers, as well as local bankers and wealthy citizens, began to load their stores, vaults, and prized possessions onto rented freight trains bound for Philadelphia. In the wee hours of June 16th, at 1 a.m., panic had once again swept through the town as an orange glow lit up the southwestern sky. "The rebels are coming and burning as they go," a voice in the crowd speculated. Fanny Bueller, wife of attorney and Gettysburg postmaster David Bueller, remarked in her memoirs that the people of Gettysburg were in a condition to believe anything. And it seems she was right, for the glow that so scared Gettysburgians during those early morning hours was the town of Emmitsburg, Maryland. Arson was its cause, and the flames brought 27 buildings to the ground before the fire was out. No Confederates had a hand in it. The 16th passed without incident, and another false alarm was raised on the 17th. By this point, some people began falling back into that familiar rut of doubt and complacency. Fanny Bueller recalled that when they did not come, we lost faith in their coming, and it grew to be an old story. We tried to make ourselves believe that they would never come. One day, a crowd had gathered at Alexander Bueller's drugstore on Chambersburg Street. About 60 men had answered Governor Andrew Curtin's call for volunteers to drive out the rebel invaders. These men were immediately shipped off to Harrisburg, where they were mustered into service as Company A, 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Volunteer Infantry, or PEV, and they received rudimentary training.
Upon the first rumor of the rebel invasion, Major Robert Bell, a citizen of the place, recruited a company of cavalry from the town and surrounding country. A company of infantry was also formed from the students and citizens of the place, which was mustered into Colonel William Jennings' regiment of the Pennsylvania Emergency Troops. Tilly Pierce.
Local citizen Robert Bell had the presence of mind to realize that this latest string of rumors could very well be legitimate. And so he reorganized a home guard company of independent cavalry. He went to Andrew Curtin and offered to bring his cavalry to Harrisburg. But Curtin declined because he needed eyes on the Confederate Army's activities in south-central Pennsylvania. Bell returned to Gettysburg, and set his cavalry out on patrols in search of advanced elements of Lee's army in the mountain passes at Cashtown and Monterey to the west. Bell's scouts would relay information back to Gettysburg resident David McConaughey. McConaughey, a local attorney turned spy ring leader, was in constant contact with Governor Curtin by telegraph. Major Grantville O. Haller, of General Darius Couch's staff, came to Gettysburg to take command of the defense of that area on June 19th.
June 20th. The report of today is that the rebels are at Chambersburg and are advancing on here, and refugees begin to come in by scores. Some say the rebels number from 20 to 30,000. All day we have been much excited. Sarah Broadhead.
On June 21st, 40 men from the Philadelphia City Troop arrived and joined Bell. Samuel J. Randall, a U.S. congressman, came up from Washington to take command of these men. This small band of civilians playing soldier was all that Gettysburg had to protect it from any possible Confederate incursion into the borough.
Early on this morning, the Philadelphia City Troop, consisting of about 40 members, arrived at Gettysburg, affording us evidence that the border was not entirely forgotten. Professor Michael Jacobs, Pennsylvania College.
2 cavalry companies are here on scouting duty, but they can be of little use, as they have never seen service. Sarah Broadhead.
Bell's cavalry and the Philadelphia City Troop skirmished near Monterey Pass and brought word back to town that Confederates of a sizable force were in the mountains just beyond the border of Adams County.
June 22nd, Sunday. The report now is that a large force is in the mountains about 18 miles away, and a call is made for a party of men to go out and cut down trees to obstruct the passages of the mountains. About 50, among them my husband, started. I was very uneasy lest they might be captured, but they had not gone halfway when the discovery was made that it was too late, that the rebels were on this side of the mountain and coming this way. Our men turned back, uninjured though. Sarah Broadhead.
This small party had encountered the head of a small Confederate force foraging for horses and other supplies. The rebels fired off a few shots, and Bell's men retired to town. Word had come to Gettysburg by telegram that Gettysburg's own Company A of the 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Volunteers was on its way with the rest of the regiment.
June 24th. As I expected, the rebels have several times been within 2 or 3 miles, but they have not yet reached here. Deserters come in every little while who report the enemy near in large force. This morning early, a dispatch was received, saying that a regiment of infantry was coming from Harrisburg. We do not feel much safer, for they are only raw militia. Sarah Broadhead.
The plan for the 26th PEV's return to defend Adams County went off the rails, quite literally, when one of the trains carrying the Green troops collided with a stray cow at Swift Run Bridge, roughly 7.5 miles from Gettysburg, derailing the train. No one was killed or seriously injured besides the cow, and she made for an enjoyable steak dinner for the raw recruits. 120 men of the regiment marched on to Gettysburg, arriving there on the night of the 25th. The remainder of the regiment arrived by rail the following morning. Back in Virginia, at 1 a.m. on June 25th, Jeb Stuart, following orders from Robert E. Lee, left 2 of his 5 brigades with the main body of the Army to guard the passes and the Army's rear as it crossed the Potomac. Stuart took his remaining 3 brigades on a troublemaking ride around the Union Army. Confederate guerrilla John S. Mosby had earlier reported to Stuart that the Union Army had not moved for 6 days. Lee's orders, though rather vague and confusing, did call for Stuart to cross the Potomac and link up with Ewell's right should Stuart find Hooker's army to be on the move. Within hours of setting out on his ride, Stuart was immediately thrown off course. For starters, when his cavalrymen came through Glasscock's Gap near Haymarket, Virginia, they found Winfield Scott Hancock's entire 2nd Corps spread out in the fields before them. Some light skirmishing took place before Stuart withdrew and moved his troops south and then east to get around Hancock. This same morning, Hooker ordered his army to begin its march north after a 6-day halt in pursuit of the Army of Northern Virginia. Back in Gettysburg, the 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Volunteers arrived on the morning of Friday, June 26th. Though mostly comprised of students from Pennsylvania College, they received a warm welcome from the citizens of Gettysburg as if they were their own. With Bell's cavalry in the lead, the 26th moved down Chambersburg Street and west of town along the Chambersburg Pike. Once they left the town, something of an ominous calm, according to Professor Jacobs, fell over the town. Perhaps enough people believed that their boys would scare Lee's army off, or that the 26th would return reporting yet another false alarm. Meanwhile, the Army of Northern Virginia was on the move. In the lead was Richard S. Ewell's 2nd Corps, with the divisions of Rhodes and Johnson headed northeast towards Carlisle. Ewell's remaining division, under Major General Jubal A. Early, struck out to the east of Chambersburg with the goal of reaching York before eventually cutting north to link up with Ewell. Along the way, just before reaching the Cashtown Gap in the mountains,
Early's division burned the Caledonia Iron Works,
about 15 miles from Gettysburg. The Iron Works were owned by staunch abolitionist and United States Congressman Thaddeus Stevens. Early decided that Stevens and his workers needed a special dose of Southern vengeance for not only the treatment the Yankee troops had given Early's countrymen, but also as a message aimed directly at Stevens, who Early thought had a most vindictive spirit towards the people of the South. Learning of the Union militia west of Gettysburg, along the Chambersburg Pike, Early rode with 3 brigades north to Mummersburg, while he sent Gordon's brigade east towards Gettysburg, preceded by the 35th Virginia Cavalry Battalion. Shortly after 2 in the afternoon, Bell's cavalry came galloping through town in helter-skelter fashion, yelling the news that the 26th had been routed and was retreating to the northeast. Those Confederates who weren't on the trail of the 26th were a mere 2 miles away and heading straight to Gettysburg. The alarms were false no more. To make matters worse, Bell's cavalry, along with the Philadelphia City Troop, which had stayed behind in town that morning, scattered on the roads heading south and east, leaving Gettysburg to once again fend for itself. Sarah Broadhead reported that the town's reaction, even after the episode with Bell's cavalry, was incredulous. No one believed this, she wrote, for they had so often been reported as coming. Then suddenly, rebel cavalry appeared. Disbelief was now shattered by reality. It was the 35th Virginia Cavalry Battalion, known by the terrifying nom de guerre of White's Comanches. Carrie Sheeds dismissed her students from her finishing school near the Lutheran Seminary on the Chambersburg Pike. The girls from the school ran straight for town. Just before entering it, possibly near the home of John Burns, they paused briefly to look back to see if the rebels were really coming. Upon seeing the first rebel riders crest Seminary Ridge about a half a mile away, the gaggle of girls turned on their heels and retreated for the safety of the town. At the intersection of Chambersburg and Washington Streets, they ducked into the perceived safety of the lobby of the Eagle Hotel. A good deal of Gettysburg civilians had already fled the town. 19-year-old Nellie Auchenbaugh's mother would not lower herself to abandon her home. Nellie was learning to be a woman's hat maker or milliner at Mrs. Mary Martin's hat shop.
I was working on a bonnet that Miss Martin, who was very particular, had me rip up twice that day and start over again. And I said, I'm not going home until I finish this bonnet. Not if the whole rebel army comes to town.
A few blocks to the south, the students of Rebecca Eyster's Young Ladies Seminary on the corner of High and South Washington Streets were also dismissed in haste. One of the students there was 15-year-old Matilda Tilly Pierce. Tilly took her teacher's advice to hurry home and raced the 2 blocks to her house. Charles McCurdy, a 10-year-old, was more curious than frightened by the rebels and the excitement they caused. He ran down to the end of Chambersburg Street and found men and boys in a crowd gazing towards Seminary Ridge, trying to find the approaching Confederates. Another boy in the town had a toy cannon fashioned from a section of gas pipe. Surely miming the martial pomp and circumstance he had witnessed in less dangerous days, the boy fired off a salute. While loading for a second one, White's Comanches appeared coming over the ridge, and the men in the crowd stopped the boy out of fear of bringing about a Confederate response. As soon as the Comanches were in sight, the entertainment value of rebels at the gates dissolved into fear and worry, and the mood became a somber one. I waited only for the front line to come into view, Charles McCurdy remembered. Making record time for home and stationing myself on the front porch, watched the spectacular view. White's Comanches reached the bottom of Chambersburg Street and spurred their horses to a gallop, raced through the streets of town, firing their pistols and whooping and hollering as they rode. Sarah Broadhead remembered that the effect was enough to frighten us all, while young boys like Charles McCurdy and Gates Fonstock peered curiously out the windows of their homes, viewing it as rather a leisurely and gentle entry, and enjoyed it as if they were a Wild West show. As Colonel White's rebel cavalry fanned out through town, things started happening more rapidly, and Tilly Pierce, now safely at home, started to become frightened.
I had scarcely reached the front door when, on looking up the street, I saw some of the men on horseback. I scrambled in, shut the door, and hastening to the sitting room, peeped out between the shutters. What a horrible sight! There they were, human beings, clad almost in rags, covered with dust, riding wildly pell-mell down the hill towards our home, shouting, yelling most unearthly, cursing, brandishing their revolvers, and firing right and left. I was fully persuaded that the rebels had actually come at last. What they would do to us was a fearful question to my young mind. Tilly Pierce.
Those members of White's cavalry who headed south down Baltimore Street accomplished little more than stealing a few horses near the Evergreen Cemetery and engaging in a brief firefight with 2 of Bell's cavalrymen who had not fled far enough. This shootout resulted in the death of George Washington Sandow, a member of Bell's cavalry and the first Union soldier to die at Gettysburg. By now, the strain on the civilians of Gettysburg was beginning to shed light on underlying animosities between families. Along with the captured horses, the men of White's cavalry captured several boys. Among them was 12-year-old Sam Wade. Sam's family, who lived on Breckenridge Street, was poor, and he was living with the Pierce family as a hired boy. As White's men led the horses and prisoners back towards the center of town, they passed the Pierce residence on the corner of Baltimore Street and Breckenridge. "You don't want that boy," Mrs. Pierce yelled to one of the cavalrymen. "He is not our boy. He is only living with us." "No, we don't," the Confederate yelled back. You can have them. We are only after the horses. Sam's sister, Jenny, witnessed the whole exchange from nearby. Placing responsibility for her younger brother's present situation on the Pierces, she yelled, "If the Rebs take our Sam, I don't know what I'll do with you folks." Sam was returned to his family unharmed. A while later, Mr. Pierce approached Colonel White at the Diamond to plead for his horse's return. White refused, stating that he had heard that Mr. Pierce was a black abolitionist and that he had 2 sons in the Union Army whom he supposed had taken as much from the South as they were taking from him. Tilly Pierce was certain that Jenny Wade was the source of White's knowledge of her father's views and her brother's service to the Union cause. Not to let this slight slide, Tilly hinted not so subtly that Jenny and the Wades were Southern sympathizers. This was most likely not true, as Jenny had 2 brothers and a boyfriend in the Union Army. Even if it were true, it would not have been the only situation during the Battle of Gettysburg when neighbors turned on neighbors to save their own skin. Still, some residents seemed to approach this invasion of their town with a sense of curiosity, as if they were watching some street performance more than an act of war. One such resident was Sarah King, who lived on the eastern side of town. As White's men chased Captain Bell himself, Sarah's father was sitting in his chair near the window with his nose in his newspaper when the chase galloped by the house. "Here they come!" shouted Sarah. "Who?" asked her oblivious father. "The Rebs!" she exclaimed. "Don't you hear the yell?" As Sarah stood with her children on the porch watching the spectacle, her more rational father thought of the children's safety and urged her to bring them inside. "No," Sarah responded. "I want them to see all they can of this." Oblivious to the danger, Sarah thought it was more important for her children to witness history in the making. She got her wish, and by the end of 1863, her children would witness far more history than she had bargained for. Lagging a half hour behind White's Comanches on the Chambersburg Pike was the infantry brigade of Brigadier General John B. Gordon. Now, the gravity of the situation appeared to set in on more of the citizenry. Early had come to Gettysburg with Gordon's brigade, intending to requisition supplies from the good folks of the town. Upon arrival, Early demanded to speak to the mayor, or Burgess, Robert Martin. But Martin had already fled, and so the general had been directed to the home of Borough Council President David Kendallhart. Kendallhart met Early outside his home and stood in front of Early's horse as the general read the list of demands. Kendallhart's daughter recorded what Early wished to requisition: 60 barrels of flour, 7,000 pounds of bacon, 1,200 pounds of sugar, 600 pounds of coffee, 1,000 pounds of salt, 40 bushels of onions, 1,000 pairs of shoes, and 500 hats. Kendallhart responded with a prepared letter. General Early, Sir, the authorities of the borough of Gettysburg, in answer to the demands made by you upon the said borough and county, say their authority extends but to the borough, that the requisitions asked for cannot be given because it is utterly impossible to so comply. The quantities required are far beyond that in our possession. In compliance, however, to the demands, we will request the stores to be opened and the citizens to furnish whatever they can of such provisions, etc., as may be asked. Further, we cannot promise. By authority of the Council of the Borough of Gettysburg, I hereunto, as president of said board, attach my name, D. Kendallhart. Satisfied with Kendallhart's response, Early spared Gettysburg of any acts of retaliation. However, his men did take advantage of merchants opening their doors to them. By all accounts, the appearance of Early's men disclosed how poor and ill-equipped they were. Michael Jacobs remarked on how their filthy condition was a far cry from the chivalrous Southerners they were thought to be. Sarah King compared them to Falstaff's recruits, meaning that they did not look fit for battle, and expressed a feeling of sympathy for them.
Some of the men had a pile of hats on their heads, strings of muslin and other goods trailing on the ground. The blankets, quilts, and shawls were piled on their horses.
The Confederate troops were in such poor condition in the way of clothes and shoes that Albertus McCurdy observed a Confederate riding his horse with spurs strapped to his bare feet. Appearances aside, Early's men did very little in the way of bringing damage to property or person. Unlike their Yankee foes at Fredericksburg, Confederates did not loot Gettysburg, although that's merely semantics, for they purchased their items with Confederate currency that was completely useless to the residents of Gettysburg. But not according to one rebel lieutenant who told Charles Will, proprietor of the Globe Inn on York Street, after purchasing whiskey from him, that in 2 months our money will be better than yours, and we may remain in your state an indefinite time. Sweets were also very prized among Confederates. Young Charles McCurdy lived on Chambersburg Street across from Petey Winter's candy store. Winter, like everyone else, closed up shop prior to the visit from the Confederates. However, once the ragged boys in Butternut noticed what wares Winter had to offer, he was forced to open. Charles McCurdy watched the free-for-all play out across the street. He was encountered by a Confederate trooper with his hat brimming with candy. McCurdy later recalled that the trooper saw an expectant-looking small boy gazing enviously at his store. The trooper, in an act of kindness, let McCurdy take a handful. The circus-like atmosphere the Confederates brought to the white citizens of Gettysburg was proving to be far less frightening than their imaginations had constructed. Not all civilians were so naive. Gettysburg's black citizens could not afford to bury its collective head in the sand like their white neighbors could. For them, capture could mean enslavement, or for all they knew, wholesale slaughter. They could not know for sure what was about to befall them, and few were willing to sit around and wait to see. As they had done many times before, they gathered whatever belongings they could carry, and with their children in tow, left town for their usual hideouts.
On these occasions, it was also amusing to behold the conduct of the colored people of the town. They regarded the rebels as having an especial hatred towards them and believed that if they fell into their hands, annihilation was sure. These folks mostly lived in the southwestern part of the town, and their flight was invariably down Breckenridge Street and Baltimore Street, towards the woods on and around Culp's Hill. I can see them yet. Men and women with bundles as large as old-fashioned feather ticks slung across their backs, almost bearing them to the ground. Children also, carrying their bundles and striving in vain to keep up with their seniors. The greatest consternation was depicted on all their countenances as they hurried along, crowding and running against each other in their confusion, children stumbling, falling, and crying. Mothers, anxious for their offspring, would stop for a moment to hurry them up, saying, "For the Lord's sake, you children, come right along quick. If them rebels done cut you, they tear you all up." These terrible warnings were sure to have the desired effect, for, with their eyes open wider than ever, they were not long in hastening their steps. Tilly Pierce.
The 1860 census listed 186 black residents in the town of Gettysburg. The counties in Robert E. Lee's path had just over 5,600 black people. Many had never lived a day as a slave, nor had most traveled further than 20 or 30 miles from their homes, let alone to the south. When word spread of the Confederate invasion, most fled further north to avoid capture. There was no standing order or policy in the Army of Northern Virginia to round up black people in order to send them south to be sold into slavery. But that did not stop the officers and their units from acting independently and kidnapping and shipping south human cargo along with whatever goods and property they can get their hands on, whether for personal gain or for the benefit of the Army. For whatever reasons, many of Gettysburg's black citizens did not leave town ahead of the approaching sinister gray cloud and were caught and lined up on Chambersburg Street. From there, the moaning and crying mass of misfortune was marched under guard west towards the mountains to be taken south and sold into slavery. Albertus McCreary witnessed the capture of one black man. "Goodbye," he said. "We are going back into slavery." A woman named Aunt Liz was able to slip out of line and hide in the belfry of the Christ Lutheran Church until the Confederates left town. Scenes like this were repeated throughout the early days of the Confederate invasion of South Central Pennsylvania. Some white Pennsylvanians were able to appeal to the Confederates on behalf of their black friends and won their release back into freedom. Mary Warren's mother, feeling sorry for a terrified black minister's widow and child, took them into her West Middle Street home and hid them above her kitchen until it was safe to let them out. As June 26 came to a close, a band with Gordon's brigade set up in the Diamond in front of the home of attorney David Wills and put on an impromptu concert for their hosts. That night, 17 railroad cars were burned by Early's men. The bridge over nearby Rock Creek was also destroyed. Railroad tracks were torn up and telegraph wires were cut. Gettysburg was now cut off from the outside world. Where are the armies now? General Hooker spent June 26th moving his army across the Potomac River. By nightfall, everyone was in Maryland except John Sedgwick's 6th Corps and a portion of the cavalry. Frederick, Maryland, Hooker decided, would become the Army's point of concentration. The first wing of the Union Army to cross the Potomac were the 3 Corps under the command of Major General John F. Reynolds. Contrary to their orders to send word to Lee when the Army of the Potomac crossed the river, Confederate cavalry commanders Beverly Robertson and Grumble Jones failed to report this movement to Lee. Back in Washington, Lincoln began showing signs of doubt in Hooker. According to Navy Secretary Gideon Welles, Hooker may commit the same faults as McClellan and lose his chance. But Lincoln quickly added a sign of hope when he said, "We shall soon see, but it appears to me he can't help but win."
Boys, you are now on the enemy's soil. Stack your arms and do pretty much as you please. Major General John Bell Hood, Army of Northern Virginia.
Lee, meanwhile, had risen at Williamsport, Maryland early on the 26th, made his way through Hagerstown, and arrived at Chambersburg around 9 a.m. Jacob Hoke saw Lee as he came into town.
He was at that time about 52 years of age, stoutly built, of medium height, hair strongly mixed with gray and a rough graying beard. His whole appearance indicated dignity, composure, and disregard for the gaudy trappings of war. Jacob Hoke.
Though incorrectly pegging Lee as 4 years younger than his actual age, Hoke paid close attention to which direction the general traveled. He managed to send word to Couch's headquarters in Harrisburg with the information he gathered. Just a short distance east of town, Lee halted and set up camp in a grove that locals used as a popular picnic spot named Messersmith's Woods. Lee's orders for Longstreet and Hill for that day were to rest their respective corps. Despite Lee's General Order 72, which empowered only certain officers with authority to requisition supplies and control rampant looting, Longstreet's men enjoyed themselves in Chambersburg. A good number of them found whiskey and other spirits. One First Corps man boasted that they had marched in 4 states that day, the 4th in a state of intoxication. One of Longstreet's artillery commanders and prolific diarist, E. Porter Alexander, noted how the roads had been muddy and hard for the infantry to use. So they marched parallel to the road, often through the lush wheat fields found alongside the way. Joseph Hooker, meanwhile, seemed bewildered. "He acts like a man without a plan," griped one of Hooker's staff officers, "and is entirely at a loss what to do, or how to match the enemy or counteract his movements." To Hooker's credit, he seemed to agree with his staff's assessment privately, if not publicly. The bluster he displayed leading into the Chancellorsville Campaign no longer colored his words or actions. As he wrote to his chief, General Halleck, "I don't know whether I am standing on my head or feet." President Lincoln, his Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck all agreed that Hooker's conduct during the Battle of Chancellorsville was less than satisfactory, and they could not afford to have Hooker at the head of the Army of the Potomac during another major battle. Lincoln had reason to be cautious, though. To replace Hooker while an invading army was on northern soil may not have been a wise move, given the history of turnover for commanders of the Potomac Army. Instead, they would wait to see how things would play out.
It seemed pleasant once more to see smiling faces and to be greeted with friendly words. The women cheered us and waved their handkerchiefs as well. Charles Davis, 13th Massachusetts.
By June 27th, Lincoln's call for 100,000 emergency volunteers yielded only 12,000 Northern men to fill the ranks of the Department of the Susquehanna. 8,000 of them were from New York. In response, Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin called for 60,000 90-day volunteers to join the state militia. 24,000 answered that call, but regardless, there was just not enough time for them to be trained and mustered into service before the two armies met at Gettysburg. Meanwhile, the Confederate Corps Commander Richard S. Ewell accompanied Rodes's division to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, some 35 miles north of Gettysburg. Carlisle was home to the Carlisle Barracks, where Ewell had been stationed for a time before the war, and he spent some of that Saturday receiving visits from old friends he had met there. As pleasant as these reunions may have been, Ewell eventually commenced with his actual mission of gathering supplies. Once settled into his headquarters, he demanded the citizens provide his men with 1,500 barrels of flour, 5,000 pounds of coffee, medicine, surgical instruments, and other stores. Lacking a satisfactory response, Ewell ordered a house-to-house search of Carlisle. During the Second Corps' 3-night stay, the generals feasted on food left behind by the fleeing Yankee garrison, like iced salmon. A soldier of the 12th Alabama Infantry was determined to have a nice dinner at the National Hotel in Carlisle, where he registered in the midst of an unfriendly and rough-looking crowd of rough-looking men. had a poor dinner rather ungraciously served by a Dutchy-looking young waitress. Of the booty captured in Carlisle were gallons of Pennsylvania whiskey. To celebrate the success of the invasion thus far, Rhodes's division put on a parade, during which a young drunken lieutenant gave a speech that ran a shade too blue and had to be hauled off by his comrades. Confederate officers and men alike indulged in spirits and gave drunken speeches from balconies to their troops on the streets below. Earlier that morning, Joseph Hooker traveled to Harper's Ferry to inspect the 11,000-man garrison there. In response to his request to abandon the garrison and absorb it into the Army of the Potomac, Hooker's boss, Henry Halleck, said no. Feeling his hands were tied, frustrated and angry from the resistance above, Hooker tendered his resignation to the authorities in Washington on June 27th. Lincoln, without batting an eye, accepted. Meade takes command. It was 3 a.m., and so quiet at 5th Corps headquarters that the slightest sounds could be noticed. So it was no surprise that 5th Corps Commander Major General George Meade's slumber was disturbed by the sounds of voices outside his tent. There was a visitor to camp who was asking for access to the general. Being that Meade's staff officers were all camped in the vicinity of his tent, they too could hear the voices, and one by one would emerge, curious as to the matter at hand. When Meade lay down to sleep only a few hours earlier, he did so having fulfilled his duties for the day and was expecting to wake up in the morning and fulfill whatever duties he would be assigned for that day. He marched his men 16 miles from near the Monocacy River to Bollinger's Creek, 3 miles due south of Frederick, Maryland. Upon arrival, he went into the town to find Hooker, whom he had not seen since June 13th. Hooker had not yet arrived, so Meade returned to his corps, saw to their encampment, and retired for the evening. He was unaware that Hooker had resigned, and that one of General-in-Chief Halleck's staff officers, Colonel James A. Hardee, and a small party were on their way to meet Meade. Hardee roused Meade in his tent and told him that he came bearing trouble. Meade, whose sense of humor was just as groggy as he was at this hour, assumed that Hardee's mission was, as he wrote to his wife, to either relieve or arrest me. So Meade's response to Hardee's joke was, "My conscience is clear." Meade believed that he was being placed under arrest because of a previous issue with General Hooker. Hardee then handed Meade a communication to read, which relieved Hooker as commander of the Army of the Potomac and put Meade in his place. Unlike prior occasions when Lincoln replaced a general, this was not an offer nor a request. It read, "General, you will receive with this the order of the President placing you in command of the Army of the Potomac. Considering the circumstances, no one ever received a more important command, and I cannot doubt that you will fully justify the confidence which the government has reposed in you." It was an order, and Meade, ever the dutiful soldier, obeyed. And so Meade, Hardee, and Meade's son and staff officer, Captain George Meade, Jr., rode to Army headquarters in Frederick to meet with Hooker. There was little conversation among the three as they rode. Now and again, Meade, the elder, would depart from his visibly evident deep thought and ask Hardee a question. Then he'd go back to thinking. At Frederick, he met with Hooker, who, with his usual charm, tried his best to assuage the embarrassment and awkwardness of the occasion. They sat down and had a lengthy discussion and were eventually joined by the Army's Chief of Staff, Daniel Butterfield. Finally, Meade came out of the meeting with the same grave look on his face as when he went in. Upon seeing his son, he perked up slightly. "Well, George," he said, "I'm in command of the Army of the Potomac." It can be assumed that Meade learned about the disposition of the army, though he did admit that he had no exact information about the condition of the troops and the position of the enemy. He would also later claim that Hooker offered him no intimation of any plan or any views he may have had up to that moment. Meade formally accepted command in a message to Halleck. "The order placing me in command of this army is received. As a soldier, I obey it, and to the utmost of my ability will execute it." Meade spent the 28th poring over dispatches at Army headquarters to familiarize himself with the situation.
June 28th was spent in ascertaining the position and strength of the different corps of the Army, but principally in bringing up the cavalry, which had been covering the rear of the Army in its passage over the Potomac, and to which a large increase had just been made from the forces previously attached to defenses of Washington. Orders were given on that day to Major General French, commanding at Harper's Ferry, to move with 7,000 men of his command to occupy Frederick and the line of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and with the balance of his force estimated at 4,000, to remove and escort the public property to Washington. Major General George Gordon Meade, Commander, Army of the Potomac.
By that night, he had issued general orders for the Army's march. These ambitious orders set the Army of the Potomac on a collision course with the Army of Northern Virginia. The only question now was, where would they collide? Overall, Meade's appointment to command was well received, even though most outside of his own 5th Corps knew little about the man. A good deal of the rank and file wished that McClellan would be reinstated, and Lieutenant Henry P. Clare, the 83rd New York's adjutant, prayed that McClellan be placed in command once again. If not, then he prayed that Jeff Davis enters Washington, hangs Lincoln and all his damnable associates, proclaiming himself president. Clare was willing to part with a month's pay to see Washington sacked and the present clique chased like bayed foxes with bloodhounds after them. In the high command, Major General Daniel Sickles and Chief of Staff Daniel Butterfield were among the few who were sad to see Hooker go. Sickles and Meade were not friends. The others were pleased with the selection. John F. Reynolds was the ranking general of them all, and Lincoln had offered him command of the Army prior to assigning it to Meade. But Reynolds had seen how much Washington meddled with the Army's commander's operations and respectfully declined the offer. However, he did suggest that George Meade would make a good commander if it came to that. Reynolds was also Meade's friend. When Reynolds first saw Meade after he took command, Meade told him that his new job was not only a surprise, but an unwelcome one at that. Reynolds told Meade that the commanding general could rely on him and that he was satisfied to see Meade at the head of the Army. Things were now accelerated as though Meade's appointment so invigorated the high command and gave it a new sense of purpose and resolve. Meade conferred with staff and drew up orders announcing that he was placed in command of the Army, along with marching orders for the day. Each corps knew where it needed to be by nightfall and by what roads, and by nightfall, all were where they should have been. Only Hancock's 2nd Corps was just a few miles short of its destination because it received its orders too late.
Carrying rifle, knapsack and contents, accoutrements, haversack containing rations, and 60 rounds of cartridges, over 50 pounds. Union 6th Corps soldier.
As to the progress of Meade's forces, Lee's army was enjoying the bliss of ignorance. Longstreet's and Hill's corps were concentrated around Chambersburg to the west of Gettysburg, while Ewell was split up between York to the east and Carlisle to the north. The 9th Alabama of Anderson's division of A.P. Hill's corps passed through Marion and Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. In his diary, one soldier recorded a touching event that he witnessed.
The females of Chambersburg seem to be spiteful, make faces, sing, wave their banners, etc. A widow in the place discovered the knapsack of her deceased husband in the command. She wished it, and the soldier gave it to her. He had picked it up on the battlefield of Gaines Mills, where we fought the Pennsylvania bucktails. Such is war.
Around 3 a.m. on the morning of June 28th, Jeb Stuart's cavalry had finally crossed the Potomac and was in Maryland. But Stuart was east of the Union Army, which was east of his own army. Along the way, Stuart's men managed to cut the telegraph lines connecting Frederick, Maryland to Washington, D.C., stymieing the Army of the Potomac's ability to quickly communicate with Washington during this critical time in the campaign. Meade set up a courier service along the telegraph route, but this slowed information coming to and going from his headquarters. As Hooker had before him, Meade relied on Colonel Sharp's Bureau of Military Information. It was Lee's intention to hold the Cashtown Gap in order to protect his lines of communication, supply, and retreat back into the Valley and Virginia. A.P. Hill's Corps took the lead east through the mountains to Cashtown, followed by Longstreet's Corps. At the head of Hill's column was the division of newly minted Major General Henry Harry Heath. As his unit arrived at Cashtown, a gunner in Hill's Corps was unsettled by the words of a woman along the roadside. "You are marching mighty proudly now," she shouted, "but you will come back faster than you went." Unable to resist the temptation, an officer asked why she thought that was. "Because," she quickly replied, "you put your trust in General Lee and not in the Lord Almighty." Up north in Carlisle, General Ewell declared this day a day of rest. Despite this, he sent Jenkins' cavalry ahead to Harrisburg, his next objective. Stonewall Jackson's former chaplain, the Reverend B. Tucker Lacey, held 2 church services at the Carlisle barracks. General Ewell was asked by local clergy if he objected to their offering their routine prayer for President Lincoln at their respective churches. Ewell replied, "Pray for him. I'm sure he needs it."
June 28th, Sunday. About 10 o'clock, a large body of our cavalry began to pass through town, and we were all busy feeding them as they passed along. It seemed to me that the long line would never get through. I hope they may catch the rebels and give them a sound thrashing. Some say we may look for a battle here in a few days, and others say it will be fought near Harrisburg. There is no telling where it will be. Sarah Broadhead.
General-in-Chief Halleck gave Meade a wide berth with which to command the army. In essence, he gave Meade what he denied Hooker. When Meade requested permission to pull 7,000 men from Harper's Ferry, Halleck approved. Part of Meade's orders placing him in command of the army also gave him the authority to promote, demote, or replace any officer to a position he saw fit. It was believed that the Cavalry Corps was especially in need of new leadership, and so between June 28th and June 30th, Meade jumped 3 promising young captains up 4 ranks to Brigadier General. Those junior officers were Elon J. Farnsworth, Wesley Merritt, and the long-haired George Armstrong Custer. Early in the evening of the 28th, Gettysburg resident Samuel Herbst, whose horse somehow eluded Early's Confederates on the 26th, rode the animal to the south towards Emmitsburg, Maryland, and returned with very welcome news. Thousands of Federal soldiers were encamped there and would soon be on their way to Gettysburg. One Gettysburgian recalled that the news flew through town like wildfire. Late that night, Lee was awakened and shocked to learn from a civilian spy in Longstreet's employ that the Army of the Potomac was concentrated near Frederick, well north of its namesake river, and closing in on his position fast. Lee was wary of civilian spies, but in lieu of information from Jeb Stuart, and with Longstreet vouching for the man, he was left with little choice but to believe this spy, named Henry T. Harrison. Harrison also informed Lee that Meade was now in command of the Army of the Potomac. "General Meade," Lee said, "will commit no blunder in my front, and if I make one, he will make haste to take advantage of it." General Jeb Stuart had ridden around so far from Lee that the Union Army now separated the two. There was no time for Lee to sit and wonder where Stuart was or why he had not received this information from him instead of a paid spy. He needed to act. No longer could he allow his army to be so spread out as it was. Nor could he push on to Harrisburg as he hoped, lest Meade attack him in the rear. Ewell's corps was in danger of being cut off and had to be recalled. Lee ordered Hill and Longstreet to concentrate at Cashtown, a small village at the mouth of the Gap in South Mountain, and ordered Ewell initially to Chambersburg, but then modified that order and directed Ewell to Cashtown or Gettysburg via Heidlersburg, some 10 miles northeast of Gettysburg.
On the 29th, the Army was put in motion, and on the evening of that day was in position, the left at Emmitsburg and the right at New Windsor. Buford's division of cavalry was in left flank with the advance at Gettysburg. Major General George Gordon Meade.
On the overcast and drizzly dawn of June 30th, Buford's Union cavalry encountered a small force of Heath's infantry at Fairfield, Pennsylvania. Deciding not to commit to battle, Buford withdrew his men and detoured back through Emmitsburg, Maryland, in order to arrive where his orders designated: Gettysburg. Around that time, at Cashtown, the brigade of J. Johnston Pettigrew took roll and then began its march east. Pettigrew's orders called for him to take 3 of his 4 regiments and a battery on a reconnaissance in force to collect information, and some wagons to collect supplies from Gettysburg.
It was told to General Pettigrew that he might find the town in possession of a home guard. But if, contrary to expectations, he should find any organized troops capable of making resistance, or any portion of the Army of the Potomac, he should not attack it. Major General Henry Heath.
Heath's orders apparently echoed Lee's desire to not bring on a general engagement until the entire army was together. Only a short distance into the brigade's march, and not far from Gettysburg's western limits, Pettigrew's advance party met a friendly spy who erroneously reported that a large force of enemy cavalry was already in Gettysburg. The cautious scholar general halted his column to await instructions from Heath on how to proceed. As the brigade waited, an unknown sniper took a shot at the 47th North Carolina, not far from the town of Gettysburg. The 47th's commander wisely backed the regiment off, even though the sniper didn't hit anyone. Pettigrew eventually continued on with his lead elements, gaining full view of Gettysburg by mid-morning. In Gettysburg, Sarah Broadhead's day began with relief. Her husband Joseph had returned, having walked for 36 hours from Harrisburg. Days earlier, he and other railroad workers were captured by Confederates, Sarah was told, and paroled and sent to Harrisburg. Joseph arrived around 1 a.m. on June 30th. But as one worry dissipated for Sarah, another sprung up. As Sarah looked to the west, down the Chambersburg Pike, there atop Seminary Ridge, stood the lead elements of Pettigrew's brigade.
We had a good view of them from our house, and every moment we expected to hear the booming of cannon and thought they might shell the town. Sarah Broadhead.
Meanwhile, 15 miles to the east, Jeb Stuart was aiming to link up with Ewell at Carlisle to the north and hoped to reach Hanover before the Union cavalry did. Stuart would not be so lucky. Riders approached him reporting that they had encountered Union cavalry. It was the division of Brigadier General Hugh Judson Kilpatrick, who had received his brigadier stars on June 13th and assumed command of the 3rd Cavalry Division on June 28th. A sharp cavalry battle took place in the streets and fields of Hanover, Pennsylvania. One of Stuart's aides said, "We stirred up the hornets." After slowly disengaging, Stuart withdrew towards York, having learned from a newspaper that Early's division was there. Back at Gettysburg, at around 10:30 in the morning, Pettigrew and his staff sat on Seminary Ridge. Field glasses and telescopes peered this way and that, searching for signs of the Army of the Potomac. Pettigrew advanced the skirmish line, which disappeared into the town along the Chambersburg Pike.
Our garret window afforded a clear view of the Chambersburg Road, leading up to the Blue Ridge 8 miles away. I went up to the garret, taking with me the small telescope which was used in the astronomical department at the college, a powerful glass. I could see on the top of the hill west of the town a considerable force of Confederates who had come down from the mountains. On the summit stood a group of officers, sweeping the horizon with their field glasses. Back of them, but largely hidden by the shoulder of the hill, my glass enabled me to distinguish men both of infantry and artillery commands. Suddenly, the officers on the crest of the hill turned and rode back, and almost on the heels of the retreat, a roar of shouting arose from the streets below me. I hurried downstairs and saw General John Buford's cavalry division, including 2 brigades, riding into Gettysburg from the Taneytown Road. Professor Michael Jacobs, Pennsylvania College.
That cavalry was indeed the 1st Cavalry Division of Brigadier General John Buford. Samuel Hearp's news of the day before, claiming that thousands of Union troops were just down the road, had proven true, although he was actually referring to Union infantry coming from Emmitsburg, Maryland, not cavalry from Fountaindale, Pennsylvania. While surveilling the town before them, one of Pettigrew's staff spotted a long column of Union cavalry heading towards Gettysburg on the Emmitsburg Road. Keenly aware of his orders not to bring on an engagement if the Army of the Potomac is encountered, Pettigrew took immediate steps to withdraw back to Cashtown. When Buford's division of almost 3,000 cavalrymen reached the intersection of the Emmitsburg Road and Washington Street, it turned left onto Washington, with Colonel William Gamble's brigade in the lead, its 8th Illinois Cavalry at the head of the column, and Colonel Thomas Devon's brigade behind Gamble's. The dirty and sun-bronzed troops of the 1st Cavalry Division were unaware of what the last several days had been like for the people of Gettysburg. The townspeople were in a terrible state of excitement because of Pettigrew's recent advance on the town. The troopers were pleasantly surprised by the jubilant reception they received from Gettysburg's residents, who no doubt received them as their saviors. Lieutenant John Califf, commander of the only battery of artillery with the column, recalled the little girl emerging from the crowd lining the street to hand him a bouquet of flowers. Private Harter, in the 8th Illinois, recalled how a group of schoolgirls singing the battle cry of freedom moved the men to cheer.
A crowd of us girls were standing on the corner of Washington and High Streets as these soldiers passed by, desiring to encourage them who, as we were told, would before long be in battle. My sister started to sing the old war song, Our Union Forever. As some of us did not know the whole piece, we kept repeating the chorus. Thus we sought to cheer our brave men, and we felt amply repaid when we saw that our efforts were appreciated. Their countenances brightened, and we received their thanks and cheers. After the battle, some of these soldiers told us that the singing was very good, but that they would have liked to have heard more than just the chorus. Tilly Pierce.
Cake, milk, water, and beer were passed up the moving column. Doors, windows, and balconies were filled with ladies waving handkerchiefs. Altogether, it was one of the most touching, spontaneous, and heartfelt demonstrations my eyes ever witnessed. It inspired us to heroic deeds. Captain W.C. Hazelton, 8th Illinois Cavalry.
Buford wasted no time once arriving in town, making his headquarters at the Eagle Hotel on the northeast corner of Washington and Chambersburg streets. He sent Devon's brigade north to the area of Gettysburg College and Gamble's brigade west of town along the Chambersburg Pike.
I entered this place today at 11 a.m. Found everybody in a terrible state of excitement on account of the enemy's advance on this place. He had approached to within a half-mile of town when the head of my column entered. His force was terribly exaggerated by reasonable and truthful but inexperienced men. My men and horses are fagged out. I have not been able to get any grain yet. It's all in the country and people talk instead of working. Facilities for shoeing are nothing. Burley's people seized every shoe and nail they could find. Brigadier General John Buford.
Buford's complaint about the lack of help received from the townspeople was by no means representative of all the citizens of Gettysburg. Gettysburg youth Hugh Ziegler recalled, "The boys of the town would visit the camp and ride the soldiers' horses to water, and I was one of them." According to Howard Wirt, General Buford had orders printed up by sending compositors to the office of the Star, who quickly had and typed the orders which were placarded over town.
Sale of spirited liquor of any kind in this town during its occupation by the troops is strictly prohibited. Any violation of this order will be promptly and severely punished. The giving away of liquor will be punished the same as if for sale.
Some of Buford's troopers did have in their canteens Applejack, which they had confiscated in Maryland. That night, the soldiers served some locals' liquor. Lee, in the meantime, had moved his headquarters east to the village of Greenwood at the western entrance of the Cashtown Gap, which was presently flooded with Hill's divisions and supply trains. Back at Heath's headquarters, Pettigrew told his commander what he had discovered. Heath could not believe that the force in Gettysburg was anything other than local militia. Soon A.P. Hill rode up, and Pettigrew told him about his foray into Gettysburg. Hill insisted that the cavalry he saw was probably only a small detachment of observation. Pettigrew then called an aide up to tell the story. The aide, who was known to A.P. Hill, asserted that they were well-trained troops. Still, Hill, who had only recently spoken to General Lee, could not or would not believe that any Union force was close enough to cause any worry. As a precaution, he decided to send a much larger force to Gettysburg the next morning on a reconnaissance. All day long, Union couriers were flying from headquarters to headquarters with word of Lee's whereabouts and subsequent orders from Meade to his corps commanders about where they should be placed. Meade sensed that something was in the air for the morrow. Buford was reporting 20,000 Confederates in the area of Cashtown to the west. Buford's information came from a local citizens' intelligence ring. The ring was orchestrated by spy master David McConaughey. A young Robert McLean watched General Buford dismount in front of the Ditterline residence on Chambersburg Street. Buford seated himself on the doorsteps and addressed a dispatch to General Reynolds, conveying information which Mr. David McConaughey, Esquire, was communicating verbally to him. With boyish curiosity and regardless of good manners, Robert looked over the general's shoulder as he wrote. The curious Professor Jacobs of Pennsylvania College wanted a better look at what trouble lay just 8 miles up the road. So he took the telescope used in his science class to the cupola of the Lutheran Seminary on the ridge at the western end of town that bears its name.
I began a careful examination of the mountains to the west, where the Blue Ridge describes a semicircle. Wherever the mountainsides held clearings, smoke curled upward. About the fires, I could see men walking, attending camp chores, cooking, all the activities of an army held in leash. They showed me clearly as though they were not more than a couple of 100 yards away. And below me, within easy eyeshot, were both of Buford's Federal brigades. The tide of war was for the hour halted under my very eyes. Professor Michael Jacobs, Pennsylvania College.
Major General John Reynolds had moved his corps between Emmitsburg and Gettysburg along the Emmitsburg Road. The Moritz Tavern, roughly 8 miles south of Buford's position, would become Reynolds' headquarters. He summoned Major General Oliver Otis Howard of the 11th Corps, and the two shared a meal. We had cheerful conversation on ordinary topics during the meal, Howard would later write, and then retired to a back room, where the general read me some communication he had received from General Meade, requesting us to animate our troops in view of the struggle soon to transpire. General Reynolds treated me with the most marked confidence. Now, all roads lead to Gettysburg. Back at Gettysburg, Buford learned that his division of 2,900 men was outnumbered by the Confederate forces at Cashtown under A.P. Hill. As Buford figured it, Hill was the immediate threat, being only 8 miles or so away. Still, his line would cover both the northerly and westerly approaches, with Colonel Thomas Devens' brigade covering points north, or the division's right, and Colonel William Gamble covering points west, or the division's left. Both lines of battle posted outposts miles ahead of the main line to slow any Confederate advance. Buford's plan was to conduct a defense in depth in order to buy time for Reynolds to bring up the infantry. His main line sat on McPherson's Ridge, facing west down the Chambersburg Pike, which ran on an east-west line. His skirmish line was placed roughly 2 miles west of McPherson's Ridge. If Confederates were to approach from that direction, his skirmish line would be able to slow their advance before they would reach the main line. Buford's signal officer left an account of the situation on the evening of June 30th. It demonstrates Buford's realism and no-nonsense personality.
On the night of the 30th, General Buford spent some hours with Colonel Tom Devon, and while commenting upon the information brought in by Devon's scouts, remarked that the battle would be fought at that point, and that he was afraid it would be commenced in the morning before the infantry would get up. These are his own words. Devon did not believe in so early an advance of the enemy, and remarked that he would take care of all that would attack his front during the ensuing 24 hours. Buford answered, "No, you won't. They will attack you in the morning and they will come booming. Skirmishers 3 deep. You will have to fight like the devil to hold your own until supports arrive. The enemy must know the importance of this position and will strain every nerve to secure it. And if we are able to hold it, we will do well." First Lieutenant Aaron Brainerd Jerome.
That evening, Meade was satisfied that Lee's army was in the mountains between Chambersburg and Gettysburg. Unaware of Lee's intentions, Meade ordered Reynolds to move his left wing to the place the following morning. Lee had no idea Federal infantry was within a few hours' march of Gettysburg like it was. As Major Daniel of Early's staff later said at the 5th annual reunion of the Army of Northern Virginia, such is war, a game of skill and chance, a game of chess and blind man's bluff compounded together. As the sun sank behind the mountains, Lydia Ziegler climbed the steps to the cupola of the Lutheran Seminary and soaked in the scene that spread out before her.
The campfires of the enemy were all along the Blue Mountain side, only 8 miles distant, while below us we beheld our little town entirely surrounded by thousands of campfires of the Union Army. As we stood on that height and watched the soldiers on the eve of battle, our hearts were made heavy. Many of the soldiers were engaged in letter writing, perhaps writing the last loving missives their hands would ever pen to dear ones at home. Lydia Ziegler.
The sun set at 7:24 p.m. on the last day of the first half of 1863. Any light on the land was man-made and hard to find. The moon, rising just after midnight, was almost full. As darkness blanketed the valley, there for the whole town to see out by Cashtown were the campfires of Heath's Confederate Division of A.P. Hill's Corps, dotting the mountains like stars in the night sky. It was the last night that the citizens of Gettysburg were able to delude themselves into thinking the war would pass them by.
Gettysburg, June 30th, 1863, 10:30 p.m. Major General Reynolds. I'm satisfied that A.P. Hill's Corps is massed just back of Cashtown, about 9 miles from this place. The enemy's pickets, infantry, and artillery are within 4 miles of this place, on the Cashtown Road. My parties have returned that went north, northwest, and northeast. They heard nothing of any force having passed over it lately. Near Hattiesburg today, one of my parties captured a courier of Lee's. He says Ewell's Corps is crossing the mountains from Carlisle. Rhodes' division being in Petersburg in advance. Longstreet, from all I could learn, is still behind Hill. I have many rumors and reports of the enemy advancing upon me from toward York. I have to pay attention to some of them, which causes me to overwork my horses and men. Should I have to fall back, advise me by what route. Respectfully, J&O Buford.
Captain Hazelton of the 8th Illinois Cavalry was in command of a picket post on the Chambersburg Pike near a farmer's house. That night, the farmer invited him and the soldier with him in to have supper. Hazelton explained to the farmer that he was on duty and couldn't accept the invitation. The kindly old farmer offered to hold his post for him while Hazelton ate. Eventually, the farmer went out to the men and chatted with them until late into the night. Hazelton, along with the rest of Buford's men, spread their blankets on the ground and replayed the events of the day in their minds. The encouragement given them by the citizens of Gettysburg made them feel capable of grander, nobler deeds than they had yet performed. In his dreams that night, Hazelton thought of the girls in Gettysburg that day and saw his own sisters waving their handkerchiefs. West of Marsh Creek, intersecting the Chambersburg Pike, over 800 men in the 26th North Carolina were busy setting up their picket lines. The night went without incident. In 3 days, 588 of these men would be dead or unfit for duty. Along the road between Emmitsburg, Maryland, and Gettysburg, Solomon Meredith's Iron Brigade of 1,830 men and officers camped with little concern of a battle looming on the horizon. 3 days later, they would be down 1,150 men, a loss of 63%. Confederates and Federals alike, spread out all over south-central Pennsylvania and northern Maryland, bedded down on the roads to Gettysburg and immortality.
Invasion, June 1863, was written, narrated, and produced by Matt Callery. Directed by Matt Callery and Pearl Shannon. Featuring the voices of Bradley Lee, Pearl Shannon, Patrick Gorman, Denise Chain, Bob Steenstra, Kelly Steenstra, Ron Bailey, Trent Walker, Braden Border, John Heckman, Dave Wilson, Keith Harris, The History Dame, Ray Chancellor, Dustin Smith, Keith Harvey, Matthew McClanahan, Stephen Byers, Konstantinos Hassapis, Bo Brinkman, John Thurston, and Katie Von Dedham. Historical consultation by licensed battlefield guides Bob Steenstra, Louis Trott, and Tim Smith, with additional assistance from Matt Atkinson, John Hoptack, and Ken Rich. Music by Dusty Lee Elmer, Sarah Larson and Danny Stewart, Kelly Shannon, Cody Tinnen, the California Consolidated Drum Band and Federal City Band. Narration recorded at the Destination Gettysburg Studios. Some sound effects courtesy of Quantamera and Ty DeWitt. Additional voice recording engineered by Paul Kirby. Credits read by Dustin Harmer. Copyright 2020, all rights reserved.